Hello everyone, welcome to our second episode of our Out the Whiteboard series. This week we're going to continue with our conversation surrounding nutrition. I'll briefly review some of the things and some of the points that we discussed last episode and then build upon that. So last episode we introduced the concept of these three different phases of nutrition and lifestyle prescription. We covered in detail, not in great detail, but in some detail, the components of phase one. But the whole idea behind this is that we start with our phase one prescription. Once we have those items in place, then and only then do we start to move on to our phase two items and start to get those in place. And then finally, once we have phase one and phase two items in place, then we move on to the icing on the cake, phase three. This week we're going to discuss some of the components of phase two. We'll do that in two different parts. So in this video, we're just going to talk about carbohydrates and fat prescription and kind of the requirements surrounding that as far as daily intake goes, why we need each one of those macronutrients in our diet, and some of the considerations surrounding the best sources of those things and in what quantities we should be eating them to create balance and support our activity level. So the first thing we're going to talk about is carbohydrates, otherwise known as carbs. They've been somewhat vilified over the years, but we're going to talk about why they're necessary, not in great detail, but some of the considerations for how much of it we should be eating, what the best sources of those things are, and then how we kind of figure out our own daily requirement. So carbohydrates, I mean, even though they've probably taken a bad rap over the past few years in particular, with the advent and the popularity and growth of the paleo diet and the ideas surrounding that carbohydrates are not really necessary sources of energy for us, especially anyone engaged in high intensity activity. Let's just say the average CrossFit athlete really does need carbohydrates in their diet. It's a major source of energy for all activities that we do, in particular high intensity activity. And let's just talk about some of the best sources of carbohydrates. So I'll look at it by means of kind of this pyramid going from most important to least important. And at the top is vegetables. Those should serve as the foundation of our carbohydrate intake. Now we know that vegetables are not gonna serve much by way of caloric intake, so there's not a ton of macronutrient density there, but there is a ton of micronutrient density. So for every calorie of vegetable that we consume, we're getting quite a bit of vitamins and minerals that are hard to find otherwise. So really, really important to consume as many vegetables as possible, really. Fruits, also containing a high ratio of micronutrients relative to macronutrients. So lots of vitamin minerals, lots of really important things can be found in fruits, again, that are otherwise hard to find elsewhere. Starches. So things like, and in particular, we'll discuss non-gluten containing starches. So don't think breads and pastas, things that are derived from wheat and essentially flour. So things that are still in more of a natural state, like oatmeal and rice and sweet potatoes would be three really great sources to derive your starches from. So they'll be a little bit more calorically dense, not as quite as dense in micronutrients as vegetables and fruits. So vegetables and fruits should still serve as the foundation of that. But when we're looking to increase our carbohydrate intake and support high activity levels, starches are going to become a necessary component of our diet. We want to make smart choices there. And then sugar is at the bottom of it. This should be probably even smaller. There will be instances where sugar can become valuable for people that are engaging in super high levels of activity, in situations where people are perhaps engaging in high levels of activity or high intense activity multiple times per day, let's say in a competition setting, and we just need access to sugar in the simplest form possible. But for the most part, it should be stripped out of the diet just for average health and wellness purposes as much as we possibly can. It's not to say, we can't look at that and be depressed and think, well, I'm never going to be able to eat ice cream ever again for the rest of my life. I mean, always put this stuff into context of kind of like a 90-10 rule, or even perhaps like an 80-20 rule once we really have it dialed in, that of course every once in a while it's all right if we stray from the track. So you'll still be able to eat ice cream, just not every night. Okay, so that will serve as the foundation of the types of carbohydrate sources that we're choosing primarily. If you guys need insight into exactly what's contained within each of those categories, simply ask at the gym or via email. Now, as far as determining how many carbohydrates I need to consume throughout the day, so there's two major factors that are going to play a role in that, and we've discussed this a little bit also with protein. But specifically with carbohydrates, the idea is that they need to be earned. And the way that carbohydrates are earned, and that makes it sound, I don't know, a bit rough around the edges, but it's really true in the sense that we need to really get our body fat as low as possible, within reason, within healthy levels, in order to earn the right to consume relatively high amounts of carbohydrates. And we also have to engage in relatively high levels of activity, and in particular intense forms of activity will really earn the right to eat considerable amounts of carbohydrates in the diet. So the two factors here, one is just body fat percentage, or how lean we are. Two is activity level. So the lower the body fat percentage and the higher the activity level, sort of an inverse relationship there between those two, that gives us the right to eat our carbohydrates. And so if we look at this as a spectrum, over here is relatively high body fat percentage. Over here also is low levels of activity, so let's just call it sedentary. Someone that's really not exercising at all, not really moving all that much throughout the day. They have to keep their carbohydrate intake very low. Let's call it less than 50 grams per day. And that might even be generous. If they're really high and very sedentary, we would probably be even lower than that. On the opposite end of the spectrum, obviously, is someone that has low body fat percentage. Let's call it like 10% or less. As well as a high activity level. And in particular, they're engaging in relatively intense forms of activity. That obviously earns us the right for our carbohydrate intake to be relatively high. And as what that means specifically, it's hard to say, but let's call it 1 to 2 grams per pound of body weight per day. I hope you guys can read that. It's 1 to 2 grams per pound of body weight per day. So if I weigh 200 pounds, but I have low body fat percentage, I have a high activity level, I'm engaging in intense forms of exercise, that puts me somewhere around 200 to potentially 400 grams of carbohydrates per day. There are going to be some other variables and some other considerations for that, and you can see how it's such a wide potential spectrum from one end to the other with a whole bunch of kind of question marks in the middle here. Well, where do I fall? We'll talk a little bit about that in a moment, but a lot of that is going to be done through trial and error and experimentation and based around what your specific objectives are. If weight loss is your primary objective, you're probably going to be pushing yourself closer to this end of that spectrum, regardless of your activity level. You'll still kind of push this way. If weight gain is your objective, performance is your objective, and body composition is less of a consideration, or weight loss specifically and fat loss specifically, you could probably push more towards that end of the spectrum. Okay, so that's our carbohydrate conversation. Let's look at fats now. And again, fats are another one of these things that have been vilified as far as being something that we should strip out of the diet. That's probably evolved a little bit, especially in the past, 5 or 6 years. Again, as the concept of the paleo diet became popular and people have started finding success with that, I think it's become a little bit more mainstream that fat is not bad, fat does not kill you, fat does not make you fat. That's become pretty well accepted, but it was pretty strongly indoctrinated in our mainstream consciousness for probably decades that dietary fat was something to avoid. And there was a low-fat craze that an entire industry spawned from, and I hope, and it's good that that has started to sort of become less and less popular over the past few years, because we need dietary fat for many, many reasons, just in terms of function of the body, function of our digestive system, function of our cells, just satiety, so in terms of feeling full and feeling satisfied from food. If we're not consuming fat, really, really potentially bad things can happen. And just as a rule of thumb, just to reiterate this, dietary fat does not necessarily just make you fat. It's not like you consume fat and it converts immediately into fat. It's a much more complicated mechanism in place behind that. So fats are something that are absolutely essential in our diet and really, really good for us, actually. So if we look at just the best sources of fat, one is going to be animal products, or fat that's contained in animal products. Let's just call it animal sources. So meat and eggs and things like that. Second will be, let's say, coconut. This is kind of an arbitrary list. Both coconut itself, coconut butter, coconut oil, things like that. Olives, a great source of fat. Same deal. You can either eat olives or olive oil is a great source of fat. Avocado is a great source of fat. These are just some examples. Nuts. Given there's no allergy or sensitivity to nuts, it'll also be a great source of fat in the diet. Which is better than the other? That's kind of outside the scope of this conversation. A lot of that would be built around personal preference. Probably if you do your best to include all of these various sources in your diet on a regular basis and kind of rotate through them, especially within the animal sources, try to rotate through as many different animal sources of fat as possible. That'd be a great strategy to try to follow. Now, as far as how much, again, a lot of that is going to be built around objectives, body weight, body fat percentage, activity level, so on and so forth. Fat is utilized as a major, major source of energy, particularly for aerobic activity. But just as a rule of thumb, if we look at consuming half our body weight in grams per day, that's a good starting point. That's going to be a sliding scale, again, based on several different factors. One being gut health, one being just, general ability to absorb and utilize that food, which is something that has to be done through trial and error. Fat is relatively challenging for our system to process and digest and absorb and utilize compared to other macronutrients. So we just have to figure that out through trial and error, and again, how well we perform when we utilize fat as an energy source, and then how we balance that with the other ones as well, as far as carbs and protein. So again, for a 200-pound athlete, 200-pound person, they would start at about 100 grams per day, and then make adjustments, again, based on how they respond to that, trial and error, so on and so forth, which comes back to one of the concepts we talked about in phase 1, tracking our response to food. So now let's just kind of look at, when we put all this together, in phase 1, we talked about protein intake and figuring out our daily requirement for that. Now we're talking about carbohydrates and fats, so now really what we have is all of our macronutrients. And we can start to build a little bit of a profile as far as what our daily intake of food should be and what those ratios should look like in terms of protein to carbohydrates to fat, and what percentage of calories we're getting from each one. So with our protein, if you recall, what we looked at was a sliding scale of 0.7 grams to 1.3 grams per day per pound of lean body mass. So I won't necessarily go through that whole equation again, but let's just use me as an example. So I weigh 190 pounds, depending upon the day. My body fat percentage, I don't know exactly what it is, but I estimate it at around 12%. I forget the math. I did this ahead of time, so I kind of remember. I think that works out to like 165 pounds of lean body mass, 167 pounds of lean body mass, and I use my activity level of 1.1. You know, given that I don't have an incredibly strenuous job, I'm not doing 2 workouts a day necessarily. I'm active. I work out pretty hard, 5 workouts a week, maybe 6. So 1.1. I'm at the high end of the scale, but not all the way at the high end of the scale. So that's my activity factor. And what that gives me when I do all the math is 185 grams per day of protein. That equates to 740 calories of protein per day, 185 grams. Okay. Now if I look at my carbohydrates, for carbohydrates, we had this kind of spectrum from low to high. So for me, if I just use myself as an example, and I just start with a body weight prescription of carbohydrates. So my body fat percentage is relatively low. It's not super low, but relatively low. My activity level is relatively high. I'm engaging in forms of intense exercise, and I want my protein and my carbohydrate ratio to be fairly balanced. So I'm just going to start with my body weight as a baseline. So 190 grams per day. That equates to, of carbohydrates, 760 calories of carbohydrates per day. I have made adjustments to that, so I actually consume more than that. I just, again, based on trial and error and experience and my response to that, I found that I performed best with a little bit of an increase in the carbohydrate, and it didn't necessarily affect my body fat percentage in a negative way. So I'm pretty sensitive to carbs, and if I overeat them, I tend to gain weight pretty easily. So I've found a balance point right around like 230 grams per day is working well for me right now. That will change over time. That may not have worked in the past. But right now, if I hover around that every single day, it seems to be working pretty well for body composition and, most importantly, performance for me. Now fat. Again, if we use that guideline here that we had of 1/2 pound per body weight per day, that puts me at 95 grams of fat per day. Fat is 9 calories per gram. Just got to look at the math here. It's 855 calories of fat. Per day. And again, I have since adjusted that to be a little bit higher, just because my calorie intake, I want it to be increased a little. And I do use fat as a fuel quite a bit, just because I've been doing this stuff for a while, and I've learned how to adapt to that and utilize fat as a fuel source. That's a whole nother conversation for another day. But just through trial and error, I discovered that I'm better at like 110, 120 grams per day. So the total calories, that gives me 2,355 calories per day. The percentage breakdown is basically 32% of protein, 32% of carbohydrate. I know those numbers are a little off, but just rounding up and down, 32% of each. And then 36% of my calories are derived from fat every single day. And that's a pretty good guideline. If you're somewhere in like the 30 to 40 range for each one of the macronutrients, then you're looking at a good balanced ratio across all three and a great starting point. You might make adjustments upward or downward based on how you respond to that, but that's a great way to figure that stuff out and gives you at least a baseline to get started. Again, if you guys have any questions related to that, by all means grab me. There's tools that can help you figure this stuff out on your own. MyFitnessPal, so myfitnesspal.com. There's also an app, MyFitnessPal. That's a great tool to utilize that can help you kind of do this math for you just based on things that you input. So you don't have to go through this process, but I'm happy to help you guys figure this stuff out. If you need that, it's fairly simple, and at least as far as establishing a starting point, shouldn't take that much by way of mathematics. So that kind of covers here with our phase 2 prescription carbohydrates, and fat. You can see we still have two others, food sensitivities and lifestyle factors, which are major things to consider. But we'll cover those in our next episode, in our next video, which hopefully I'll be getting shot here in the next week or so. And we'll put it up at the end of the week or early next week, something like that, and get you guys kind of the full phase 2 prescription. And then later on, we'll move on to our phase 3 icing on the cake. I still haven't figured out a good sign off, so I'll just say goodbye, and we'll see you guys next time. And I appreciate you listening. And by all means, any questions that come up related to this or anything else, please send them my way or grab me at the gym. But if I'm in my office, just stop on in and we can sit and chat. All right, thank you guys.